In this video, I want to go over the functions is and as and show how they are different. I've used is before when I wanted to create a function that could interpret dates properly in case they were correctly formatted as a date or if they were incorrectly formatted. The way the is function works is it checks whether the value can be interpreted as that data type. In this case, I have a few numbers, one with a decimal, two with a lot of decimals, and one that's absurdly big, and this is going to be a problem later on, which is why I included it. I also have three different ways to write a date, and you'll notice that this is written as text because it's on the left, it's not on the right and in italics, which means Power Query can't interpret this as a date right now. This value is supposed to be a logical true, which it was when I did this in Excel, and you'll know it's a logical value if it's on the right and in italics, which means this is also interpreted as text right now. In order to use the is function, I'll simply make a new column where I want to check if this value can be interpreted as that data type. I can just say column 1 is text. This will then give me true because right now they are all interpreted as text, which we can see here. And actually that might explain why this is on the left and not italics. When I entered this data, there was a change type step. When I did this in Excel, I had the data in an actual worksheet which was then loaded, and that's why I think some of the formatting is different. So actually I want to change this and do it in Excel, even though I don't have IntelliSense. What you can see here is that when I copied this data, Excel interpreted this as a date, as we can see here, but I want that to be general. And actually I don't want that to be general, I wanted it to be text instead. So I'll manually input the actual data I wanted. And the point of this was to show that there are different ways to write a date. This should be interpreted as a date because it's in the correct format, and this can be interpreted, but right now it's text. This one is the only date in my three options here that's actually properly identified as a date. Once again, I automatically get this change type step, which I don't want because the entire point is to check if the values are interpreted correctly. So I will do what I did before and say is my column text, which is true for some of them, but this is date time and these are all numbers. So these are correctly interpreted as text, and this is now the logical value true because it's on the right and in italics. And normally you'd want to interpret these two as dates, but in this case you can imagine that this column is manual entry without any data validation on it. I will call this is text. I can repeat the same process and ask, is my column a date? Which is not, because this is actually date time, because I have this time portion. And I didn't add this myself. This is simply Excel interpreting this value as date time, which means I can then ask, okay, well, are my values then date time instead? And normally I'd want to get rid of date time because it's an annoying format and it increases cardinality when you load it into Power BI. But it is true in this case for this one row, but these two are still interpreted as text. I can then first do type conversion, and if that type conversion version of the value is a date, then it will return true. I first want to interpret it as a date using date from, and I'll get errors here because this massive number can't be interpreted as a date. It's outside of the range. I believe Excel goes up to the year 9999, and 5 times 10 to the power of 25 is way too big. But these 5 here can be interpreted as a date. It would be the 5th day, and these ones can be interpreted as a date. Because as we see here, day 0 is the 30th of December 1899. So if you just add any number to day 0, you would get a proper date. Here, because these two text values can be interpreted as dates, they now give me the proper date. I can instead ask, is the output of this function a date? Which is this for the numbers that can be interpreted as a date or for the text that can be interpreted. I also want to check if it's a logical, and the reason I want to is because the data type is called logical and not Boolean, and that's something that tripped me up. Then I want to check if it's a number, and the reason for doing this is that number is first of all written this way, is number, and the same was true for text. You write is and then the data type, but also because number is sort of the overgroup which whole numbers and comma numbers and percentages all belong to. So any number, whether it has a comma or not, or whether it's extremely large or not, they will all belong to the number group because the number group is the over category. And then I wanted to show that you can't use this syntax if you want to check if it's a whole number, because that whole number is sort of the undergroup, which means that this syntax isn't allowed. Yeah, it won't even let me press. But if I just copy this and then manually change the code up here, this isn't allowed because it doesn't know what I'm trying to do. It would be a longer explanation, but essentially this type int64 doesn't exist. It's sort of an overlay onto the number category. And of course, Ben Gribaudo has some blog post about this concept of types. And that is this blog post where he explains the type of numbers, which means that these other data types are actually styles that are applied on top of. Specifically this portion where he discusses the 4 number types, the subcategories, and how they are all actually type number, because this thing, as he writes it, his terminology is this a claim, and then you can read more about it if you want to. It's still possible to do this, asking whether the number is a whole number. You just have to do it in a roundabout way, making your own sort of function, which is to say that first I want to detect whether this column is a number, because I don't have to do that on a text string. I would say if this fails, then I want to output false. But if it is a number, or rather if it can be interpreted as a number, I then want to say, okay, then I want to convert that value, and I know it's a number, so I can convert it into int64, and then I can ask, is this identical to the original value? Because if this is the case, this is a condition in and of itself, which means this will output true or false, and then I actually need to write then. Now 1 can be interpreted as a number, and the int64 version of 1 is equal to the value itself, because 1 is equal to 1, but the int64 version of 1, 1 is 1, which is different from 1, 1, which is why that is false. For this number, it's because it's outside of the range of the 64-bit integer, which is 2.147 billion, and this is quite a bit larger than that. So that was is, and I actually want to duplicate this because I want to do the same things only with the as keyword. Because what the as keyword does is, instead of asking, can I interpret this value as the given data type, it instead interprets the value as that data type. Meaning it doesn't ask a question which is true or false or error, it instead converts the data type. So all I have to do is write as instead, meaning interpret the value in table as a text, which will give me an error here, because you can't convert the number 1 to type text, at least not with this method. Text and 5 will still be interpreted as text because they are text, but a date is a number, which means it can't be interpreted that way. Likewise, the value true can't be converted directly to text. I could do instead text.from, which will work properly because it actually does a proper conversion. So there are probably situations where you'd want to use this, like the video I made a while back where I wanted to convert dates. You could use this because if this produces an error, you can then say that, hey, if this produces an error, that is, try otherwise, then you can keep chaining the functions together like that. So first, try to turn this value into a date, and if that's true, well, then it is a date, and if it isn't a date, do something else. And I can do the same thing here, where I instead ask, interpret this as a date, which is going to error out for all of them, because this, the one proper date, is actually datetime, which we can see here. You can convert that to the type date using this method. But again, if you do date.from, it also won't work, so that's fun, because I need parentheses. Again, I'm sure there's a situation where you'd want to use as instead of this datetype.from function, because this actually probably works, or it produces an error. And likewise, I can do as datetime, which will work, but only for the one value that actually is a datetime, which we know because it has the date portion and the time portion. Same thing here with as logical. This works for the row with true, because this is a logical value, which means interpreting it as a logical value will return its original value. And with as number, this also works properly for all of the numbers because they can be interpreted as that overgroup of number, which means these aren't actually changed, but I can filter out all the non-numbers because I could then say, go into this column and then remove errors like so, which I'm not going to do. And again, I can do this as int64 type, which also won't work because it doesn't work that way. I can only test if the value belongs to the overgroup, but I can do the same thing here with as number, and then they will all error out because this function will no longer work with as, because that's not what as does. If the column as number, this isn't a logical condition anymore. That's what is does. It asks, can this value be interpreted as the data type number? But table as number will return the value itself. What I can do instead is that I want to check if the value interpreted as a number is less than or equal to 0, or the value is greater than 0. In other words, if it's a number, then I want to do something, because now this is a conditional which can either evaluate to true or false. And then I need a parenthesis somewhere. Yeah, that's because I need to do this portion inside of my parentheses, because this has to run on its own, and likewise here. Now my condition instead is that take the value, interpret it as a number, if that's equal to or less than 0 or greater than 0. In other words, if it's a number, then I want to do the same check as before, which is to convert it into int64, meaning remove anything to the right of the comma, and then ask, is that new value equal to the original? And again, it fails if the number is too big. So I can see myself using is, like I did in the video where I wanted to convert dates properly, but I struggle to see where I'd want to use as, because it errors so easily. If the value can't be interpreted as that data type, that row will fail. So you could do it in order to combine it with remove rows. So remove any value that can't be interpreted as that data type, but I probably wouldn't use it for anything else. So yep,